The wind was a blade, honed sharp on the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains. It sliced through Willie Wren's oilskin coat, carrying a payload of ice that stung his exposed cheeks and blurred the world into a maelstrom of white. His horse, Old Red, lowered its head, a bulwark of weary muscle against the blizzard's assault. Every gust was a roaring curse, every snowflake a tiny, perfect needle. They weren't just tracking rustlers anymore. They were fighting the mountain itself, a beast roused to a fury that cared little for the ambitions of men. Willie's thoughts were as grim as the sky. 3 head of cattle gone. Not much to a man like Silas Kane, his neighbor to the east, whose herds carpeted the valleys, but to Willie it was a wound. It was winter feed he couldn't spare, money he didn't have. It was another piece of the future he was trying to build for his daughter Rose, chipped away by the relentless cruelty of the world. A world that had already taken his wife. He leaned forward, squinting into the blinding chaos. The rustlers' tracks had vanished hours ago, devoured by the storm. He was a fool to still be out here chasing ghosts on the Devil's Spine, the treacherous mountain pass where the wind was born, and good sense came to die. But turning back felt like a surrender he couldn't afford. His land, his daughter, they were all he had left. Every stolen hoofprint felt like a personal violation, a trespass on the fragile sanctuary he had carved out of this unforgiving wilderness. It was near the turnoff to the old miner's cabin, a place he hadn't visited in a year, that Old Red suddenly shied, snorting a plume of panicked steam into the air. The horse's ears flattened, its body tense. Willie's hand went instinctively to the Winchester sheathed beside his saddle. He followed the horse's terrified gaze, his own eyes straining against the gale. At first, it was just a shape, a darker bruise against the snow. A tangle of splintered wood and canvas, the ghost of a small wagon half swallowed by a deep drift. It looked like a carcass picked clean by the storm. But then he saw it, a flicker of movement, a patch of dark fabric whipping in the wind. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The cold bit at him, a physical weight on his shoulders. "Hello," he called out, his voice snatched and shredded by the wind. There was no answer. He pushed forward, rifle held ready. The wreckage was fresh. The wood wasn't yet crusted with deep ice. The canvas was torn, but not frozen solid. He rounded the splintered remains of a wheel, and his breath caught in his throat. A woman lay beside the overturned wagon, curled into a tight ball against the impossible cold. Her cloak was a tattered ruin, her dark hair fanned out against the snow like spilled ink. One of her boots was missing her exposed foot, a deathly shade of blue. She was so still, so utterly surrendered to the elements, that for a moment he thought he was too late. But then he saw the faint, ghostly puff of her breath. She was alive. Barely. He knelt, the snow soaking through his trousers. Her face was ashen, her lips chapped and pale. She was a stranger, another soul lost to the mountain's wrath. He should have felt pity, or perhaps the weary obligation of a decent man. Instead, a cold dread washed over him, far colder than the storm. It was her hand. It was clutched tightly in a fist, half buried in the snow, but he could see the glint of silver chain peeking from between her frozen fingers. With a gentleness that felt alien to his calloused hands, he pried her fingers open. They were stiff, resistant, as if guarding the most precious thing in the world. And when they finally yielded, the object nestled in her palm sent a tremor through his entire being. It was a locket. A silver oval intricately etched with the likeness of a columbine flower. The chain was delicate, the clasp a tiny handcrafted leaf. He knew it. He knew the weight of it, the feel of the cool metal, the way the light caught on the flower's petals. It was Eliza's, his wife's. He had given it to her on their wedding day. She had never taken it off. It should have been with her when she was buried, a final token of a love cut short. The last time he had seen it was a year ago on this very pass. The day the world had cracked open and swallowed his life whole. The day an avalanche had claimed Eliza, turning the pristine white snow into her tomb. Now, a year later, in the heart of another savage storm, a stranger lay near unconscious at his feet, clutching a piece of his shattered past in her hand. The question stormed through him, more violent than the blizzard itself. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why in God's name did this woman, who was a breath away from death, hold the locket of his dead wife? The mystery was a shard of ice in his gut, sharp and deeply unsettling. The rustlers, the cattle, the fight for his land, it all faded into the roaring wind. There was only the woman, the locket, and the ghost of his wife on the mountain. The ranch house was an island of warmth in a sea of white. Inside the fire, in the great stone hearth, crackled and spat, casting a flickering golden light across the rough-hewn wooden walls. Mira lay on a makeshift bed, near the flames, wrapped in a cocoon of Willie's thickest wool blankets. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, biting cold from which she had been pulled. For 2 days she had drifted in a feverish haze, her consciousness a tattered thing. Willie had tended to her with a brusque efficiency, forcing warm broth between her lips, cleaning the gash on her forehead, and applying a foul-smelling poultice to her frostbitten foot. He moved with a heavy, deliberate silence, his face a mask of stone. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and her presence was a disruption, an unwelcome riddle dropped onto his doorstep. He was hardened not just by the sun and the wind that had etched fine lines around his eyes, but by a grief that had settled deep in his bones. It had made him wary, mistrustful of anything that came from the outside world. He had built his walls high after Eliza's death, and now this stranger was inside them, sleeping by his fire, breathing his air. The silver locket sat on the mantelpiece, a silent, mocking accusation. He hadn't been able to bring himself to touch it again since taking it from her hand. On the 3rd morning, her fever broke. She awoke to the sound of a child's humming. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on a small girl sitting on the floor, arranging pine cones in a careful circle. The girl had hair the color of sun-cured wheat and eyes as blue and clear as a summer sky. She looked up, her humming ceasing, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. "You're awake," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. Mira tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. She managed only a dry rasp. The girl scrambled to her feet and ran to the kitchen. "Papa, she's awake." Willie appeared in the doorway a moment later, a dish towel in his hand. He stopped his expression, guarded his broad shoulders, filling the frame. He looked at Mira, his gaze lingering on her face, before flicking up to the locket on the mantel. "How do you feel?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "Thirsty," she managed to croak. He nodded, disappearing and returning with a dipper of water. He helped her sit up, his arm supporting her back. The brief contact was impersonal, a necessity, yet she felt the coiled strength in him. As she drank, the little girl crept closer, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and a strange, unwavering recognition. "I'm Rose," the child said softly. Mira looked at her, and for the first time since waking, a genuine emotion flickered in her own eyes, a profound confusion. She knew nothing. Her mind was a blank slate, a landscape scoured clean by the storm. She didn't know her name, where she came from, or how she'd ended up wrecked on a mountain pass. All she had was a hollow ache and a sense of pervasive, nameless loss. Rose reached out a small hand and touched Mira's arm. "Mama," she said, her voice clear and certain. The word hung in the air, charged and impossible. Willie stiffened his hand, falling away from Mira's back. "Rose, no," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We've talked about this. She's not your mother." Rose's brow furrowed, her lower lip trembling. "But she looks like her in my dreams. She feels like her." Mira stared at the child, then at Willie's grim face. The weight of their shared history, a history she was an intruder in, pressed down on her. She felt a surge of panic. She was a trespasser here, a ghost in another woman's home, being called by another woman's name. Before Willie could say more, the sound of hoofbeats crunched through the snow outside. He shot a sharp, assessing look at Mira, then moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see. A lone rider on a magnificent black stallion was making his way up the path to the house. The man was dressed in a fine tailored wool coat and a beaver felt hat that bespoke wealth and influence. Silas Kane. Willie muttered a low growl in his chest. He turned from the window, his jaw tight. Stay quiet. Don't say a word. The knock on the door was firm, confident. Willie opened it to reveal a man whose handsome features were arranged in a mask of pleasant concern. Silas Kane's smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, shrewd, and they missed nothing. Willie Silas said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. I heard you had some trouble with rustlers. Just wanted to ride over, make sure you and the little one were all right. A man can't be too careful alone up here. We're fine, Silas, Willie said, his body blocking the doorway. Silas's gaze slid past Willie into the dim interior of the cabin. His eyes widened slightly as they fell on Mira, huddled under the blankets by the fire. The polite mask faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of something else. Calculation, surprise, and a predatory interest. Well now, Silas purred, his smile returning wider this time. Looks like you've taken in a stray. It's not like you to be so charitable, Willie. Especially with the anniversary of Eliza's passing just around the corner. He let the words hang, a deliberate cruelty disguised as sympathy. This mountain takes so much. A man needs to be careful what or who he lets into his home. The veiled threat was unmistakable. Willie's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He felt Mira flinch behind him, a small, sharp intake of breath. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension, the quiet civility of the visit, a thin veneer over a deep and dangerous rivalry. Silas Kane didn't just want Willie's land. He wanted to see him broken, and he had just found a new, unexpected piece on the board. Silas Kane's presence lingered in the cabin long after his horse had disappeared over the ridge, a cloying scent of bay rum and menace. Willie stood at the closed door, his back rigid, staring at the wood grain, as if he could see through it to the threat that was now circling his home. He wants this land. Willie said, his voice flat. His father tried to buy it from my father. Now he's trying to squeeze me out. Says the water rights that feed my valley rightfully belong to him. Mira watched him from the bed, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She didn't understand the intricacies of land deeds or water rights, but she understood the look in Silas's eyes. It was a look of ownership, of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room seemed to tilt, the crackling of the fire swelling into a deafening roar. An image flashed behind her eyes, stark and violent. The suffocating whiteness of a blizzard, the sharp, angry timbre of a man's voice shouting her name, or a name followed by a deep, terrifying rumble that shook the very ground beneath her feet. She gasped, clutching her head, as a spike of pain shot through her temple. She swayed, and Willie was there in an instant, his hands on her shoulders steadying her. What is it? What did you see? He demanded, his suspicion warring with concern. A storm, she whispered, her voice trembling. A man's voice, yelling. And a sound, like the mountain falling. Willie's grip tightened. He looked from her pale, frightened face to the silver locket on the mantel. The unsettled feeling he'd harbored about Eliza's death, the quiet, persistent whisper that it wasn't just a tragic accident, intensified into a roar that matched the memory in Mira's head. Silas's visit hadn't been a neighborly call. It had been a reconnaissance mission. He'd seen her, and his presence had triggered something. Willie's protective instincts, honed by a year of solitary fatherhood and simmering grief, surged to the surface. This woman, this stranger, with his wife's locket and fractured memories, was somehow at the center of it. He didn't know if she was a victim or a conspirator, but sending her away now into Silas's orbit was a risk he couldn't take. She was a link to the past, the only key he had to understanding what truly happened on that mountain. Protecting her was no longer a matter of kindness. It was a matter of survival. "You're not going anywhere." He stated the words, an order, not an invitation. "Not until we figure this out." His decision was solidified 2 days later. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the snow on the ground glittering under a cold sun. A rider approached, not with Silas's arrogant swagger, but with the plodding official gait of the law. Deputy Miller was a fleshy, slow-moving man, whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as the highest bidder required. And in this county, Silas Kane was always the highest bidder. Miller dismounted his thumbs, hooked in his belt. "Morning, Wren." He grunted, his eyes already scanning the property. "Heard some strange reports. Thought I'd check 'em out." "What kind of reports?" Willie asked, stepping onto the porch, positioning himself between the deputy and the front door where Mira and Rose were watching. "There was an incident up on the pass a year back." Miller began, his gaze sharpening as it landed on Mira. "The avalanche that took your wife. Tragic business." He paused for effect. "We've had word there was a witness. A woman. Seen arguing with a man not far from the slide just before it gave way. Never found her. Figured the mountain took her too." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Mira. "Description's a bit vague, but folks say she was dark-haired. A stranger to these parts. Sound like anyone you know?" The question was a baited hook dangling in the frigid air. Willie's mind raced. He looked at Mira, who stood frozen, her eyes wide, with a fear that was part memory and part utter confusion. She was vulnerable, a blank page on which men like Miller and Silas could write any story they pleased. He saw Rose, her small hand clutching Mira's dress, her face a mirror of anxiety. In that instant, Willie made a choice. He was a man who valued truth, who had lived his life by a simple, unyielding code. But the law in Miller's form was a corrupted, twisted thing. It wasn't a shield for the innocent. It was a weapon for the powerful. He met the deputy's gaze, his own expression as hard and unreadable as granite. "Can't say I have," he said, the lie tasting like rust in his mouth. "Haven't seen a soul up here but my own. This woman you're looking for sounds like a ghost." Miller's eyes narrowed. He knew Willie was lying. Willie could see the knowledge plain on his face, but proving it was another matter. The deputy spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow, the stain a small, ugly violation of the pristine white. "Well," Miller said slowly, "if a ghost fitting that description happens to float by you, be sure to let me know." He mounted his horse and rode away, but the threat of his visit remained a poison seeping into the snow. Willie turned and met Mira's gaze. He had crossed a line. By lying to the law, he had made her his responsibility. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was an accomplice shielding a woman whose past was a dangerous void. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that he could not trust the men who were hunting her. The fight for his land had just become a fight for the truth, and he was standing squarely in the crossfire. The lie settled between them, a heavy, unspoken thing. It bound them together, two strangers allied against a common, shadowy threat. With Deputy Miller's visit, the ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fort under siege. Willie knew Silas would not let the matter rest. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The morning after the deputy's departure, under the cloak of a cold gray dawn, Willie saddled Old Red. "I'm going back to the pass," he told Mira. "To the wagon. There might be something there, something you left behind." "It's not safe," she said, her voice taut with anxiety. "They'll be looking. It's less safe to sit here and wait for them to come back," he replied grimly. He looked at Rose, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. "You two stay inside. Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." The ride back to the Devil's Spine was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. The blizzard had reshaped the landscape, but the wreckage of the wagon was still there, a skeletal reminder of the violence that had brought Mira into his life. He dismounted his rifle in hand and began a meticulous search. Most of the wagon's contents were ruined, scattered, and spoiled by the snow. But tucked beneath a splintered floorboard wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the wet was a leather satchel. Willie's heart hammered against his ribs. He sliced the oilskin open with his knife. Inside, he found a small collection of items, a change of clothes, a half-eaten loaf of hardtack, and a thin portfolio of documents. He scanned the papers quickly. Most were coded messages, complex strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. But one document was different. It was a partial map hand-drawn with remarkable precision, showing the network of streams and aquifers that fed the high country valleys. Several sections were circled in red ink with notations in a neat, compact script. And at the bottom of the map, a name was written: E. Wren. Eliza. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a random courier's satchel. This had something to do with his wife. Back at the ranch, he spread the map and the coded messages on the kitchen table. Mira stared at them, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sight of the document stirred something within her, like kicking at the embers of a long-dead fire. The numbers, she murmured, tracing a line with her finger. It's a book cipher. You need a key. A specific book, a specific edition. What book? Willie pressed. She shook her head, frustrated. I don't know. It's gone. As they worked, a strange partnership formed between them. His gruff suspicion began to melt in the face of her quiet determination. Her fear was tempered by a growing resolve. They were two broken people piecing together a puzzle that held the fragments of both their lives. Their conversations, once stilted and brief, deepened. He told her about Eliza, about her love for the mountains, her sharp mind, and her unshakable sense of justice. She never trusted Silas, Willie admitted, his voice low. She always said he had a rot in him, something that went deeper than just greed. Mira, in turn, shared the terrifying disjointed flashes of memory that ambushed her at unexpected moments. They came to her like shards of glass, the glint of a rifle barrel catching the winter sun. Eliza's face etched with fear, shouting a warning. The sickening sensation of the ground giving way. She remembered snow not as a soft blanket, but as a roaring white monster, an avalanche of sound and fury that consumed everything. As their bond grew, so did the pressure from outside. Silas began his campaign of attrition. One morning, Willie woke to find that the creek feeding his north pasture had dwindled to a muddy trickle. He rode upstream and found the reason: a crudely built dam of rocks and logs diverting the bulk of the water onto Silas's land. It was a brazen, deliberate act of theft. There was no one to report it to. Deputy Miller would have laughed in his face. A few days later, two of Silas's men, rough-looking brutes with mean eyes, rode up to Willie's fence line. They didn't trespass, but they sat on their horses for hours, watching their presence a silent, looming threat. His two loyal ranch hands, an old-timer named Jed, and a young man called Kobe, grew increasingly nervous. Silas is leaning on us, Willie, Jed said one evening, his weathered face grim. His foreman told Kobe's brother that anyone who works for you might find themselves out of a job everywhere else in this county. Or worse. Willie knew he couldn't ask them to risk their livelihoods, their safety, for his fight. He paid them their wages and told them to lay low for a while. The isolation was now complete. It was just him, Mira, and Rose, alone on the mountain, with Silas's net drawing tighter around them. One night, unable to sleep, Willie found himself staring at the locket on the mantel. He'd tried to open it before, but the clasp was stuck. He picked it up, the silver cool against his skin. Eliza had always fiddled with it, a nervous habit. He remembered her twisting it in her fingers, pressing the tiny columbine flower. On an impulse, he pressed down hard on the center of the flower. With a faint click, a hidden seam appeared. It wasn't the main clasp. It was a secret compartment. His fingers trembled as he worked it open. He expected to see a miniature portrait, perhaps of him or a baby rose. But it wasn't a picture. Inside, nestled in the tiny space, was a minuscule piece of paper, folded into a tight, neat square. He carefully extracted it with the tip of his knife and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, as familiar to him as his own reflection. It was Eliza's. The message was short and the words stark against the small page. Silas is a fraud. He falsified the deeds. I have the proof. Meet me at the old cabin. Be careful. The world tilted on its axis. Every piece of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal, devastating force. Eliza's trip to the pass hadn't been a leisurely ride. She was meeting someone. She had uncovered Silas's crimes, the water rights, the land deeds, all of it. And she had the evidence. He looked at Mira, who was watching him with wide, questioning eyes. He saw the satchel, the coded messages, the map with Eliza's name on it. It was her. Mira was the courier. She was on her way to meet Eliza at the old cabin to receive the proof and the avalanche. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of murder designed to kill both women and bury the truth under 1,000 tons of snow and ice. His wife hadn't been a victim of the mountain. She had been silenced. The fight was no longer about land or water. It was about murder. It was about the woman he had loved and the justice she had been denied. And the woman sitting across from him, the stranger with no memory, was the only other person who had been there. She wasn't just a key to the past. She was the last living witness to a killing. The revelation in the locket hung in the air of the cabin, a toxic, suffocating cloud. Grief, fresh and sharp, ripped through Willie. For a year he had mourned a tragedy. Now he had to face the ugliness of a betrayal. Eliza hadn't been lost. She had been taken from him. Murdered. The knowledge ignited a cold, hard rage in his soul. But it was quickly tempered by a new chilling fear. If Silas had killed once to protect his secrets, he would not hesitate to do so again. And now Mira, the one loose end from that day, was living under Willie's roof. Her returning memory was a lit fuse on a powder keg. Silas must have sensed it too. Perhaps he saw the new resolve in Willie's eyes on his next trip into the small town of Durango for supplies. Perhaps his spies, the townsfolk who depended on his patronage, reported the way Willie now watched his back. Whatever the reason, Silas decided to stop squeezing and start crushing. The blow came on a Tuesday. Willie was mending a fence on his western boundary when he saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. It was Deputy Miller this time, with a posse of 4 deputized men from Silas's own ranch. They rode with a purpose that made the hair on Willie's arms stand up. Willie Wren Miller shouted as he reined in his horse, a smug look of triumph on his face. "You're under arrest for cattle rustling." Willie stared at him dumbfounded. "What in blazes are you talking about? I've been the one getting rustled." "Funny," Miller sneered. "We found 3 of Silas Kane's cattle in your hidden box canyon this morning, still bearing his brand plain as day. He produced a warrant from his coat pocket. Got a judge to sign this. We're to search the premises and take you in." It was a frame-up, blatant and brutal. The box canyon was remote, a perfect place to plant stolen livestock, where they wouldn't be discovered until it was too late. While the posse ransacked his barn and cabin, terrorizing a weeping Rose and a stoic Mira Miller, kept Willie covered with a shotgun. They found nothing, of course, but the cattle were all the evidence they needed. The town, already swayed by Silas's wealth and whispers about the strange woman at the Wren Ranch, turned on him completely. He was no longer the grieving widower, the stoic homesteader. He was a thief, a rustler. Men who had known him his whole life now looked away when he passed. The isolation was now a public shaming. He was released on the condition that he not leave his property, until the circuit judge arrived in a month, but the damage was done. His name was Mud, but Silas wasn't finished. He saved his most vicious, most calculated attack for last. A week after the arrest, a notice was delivered by a courier. It was a legal document stamped with the county seal. Silas Kane had filed a formal petition with the court for emergency guardianship of Rose Wren. The document was filled with cruel, twisted half-truths. It painted Willie as a suspected criminal, an unstable man consorting with a woman of unknown and dangerous character. It cited his increasing isolation and erratic behavior as proof that he was an unfit father, incapable of providing a safe and morally upright home for his daughter. It argued that Rose, as the child of the late Eliza Kane, a deliberate insulting use of Silas's own surname as if claiming her in death, deserved a better, more stable environment. An environment that he, a pillar of the community, could provide. Willie's hands shook as he read the words. This was not about land anymore. This was not even about the murder. This was a direct assault on the one thing that gave his life meaning. Silas was trying to take his daughter, to steal the last precious piece of Eliza he had left. He felt the walls closing in. He was a pariah, a criminal in the eyes of the law and his community. He had no money for a fancy lawyer to fight Silas's claim. He was trapped, cornered, and facing the imminent loss of everything he held dear. He looked at Rose, who was playing on the floor blissfully unaware of the legal vice tightening around her life. A wave of desperate primal fear washed over him. He was a father, and his child was being threatened. The thought of Rose being raised under the roof of her mother's murderer was an image so horrific it threatened to shatter his sanity. He was a peaceable man, but Silas Kane had just pushed him to the edge of a violence he had long kept buried. The first snowflake of the new storm fell as Willie was chopping wood, a single perfect crystal landing on the rough bark of a pine log. Within the hour, the sky had turned a bruised purple gray, and the wind began to howl, a mournful prelude to the blizzard to come. It was as if the mountain itself was preparing for a final violent reckoning. The air grew thick with a familiar oppressive tension mirroring the storm that had raged a year ago. Willie was inside checking the action on his Winchester when he heard a sound that was not the wind. The panicked whinny of a horse from the barn. He grabbed his rifle and burst out the door, Mira and Rose just behind him. Two of Silas's men were there. One was holding the reins to Rose's small pony, while the other, a hulking man with a scarred face, was advancing on the front porch. Silas wants the girl, the man snarled. Says it's for her own good. He'll keep her safe at his place until the judge arrives. Get off my land, Willie said, his voice dangerously quiet as he raised the rifle. The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. You won't shoot. Not with the little one right here. He made a grab for Rose, who screamed and scrambled behind Mira. But before he could take another step, Mira moved. She snatched a heavy iron skillet from a hook by the door and swung it with all her might, catching the man squarely on the side of the head. He staggered back, stunned, a look of disbelief on his face. The distraction was all Willie needed. He fired a single shot into the ground at the second man's feet. The rider yelped, dropping the pony's reins and spurring his horse back toward the main trail. The first man, shaking his head to clear it, saw he was now alone and outnumbered. He glared at them, a promise of retribution in his eyes, before retreating into the swirling snow. But they all knew it wasn't over. It was just the beginning. He won't send his men next time, Willie said, his face grim. He'll come himself. His words proved prophetic. An hour later, as the blizzard reached its peak, a lone rider emerged from the white chaos. It was Silas, a dark figure on his black stallion, a second smaller horse trailing behind him. He stopped just beyond the gate, a silhouette against the storm. But he wasn't looking at the house. He was looking up toward the Devil's Spine, toward the old miner's cabin. It was an invitation, a challenge. He's going to the cabin. Mira whispered her hand, clutching Willie's arm. Where it happened. He has. Rose Willie said, his voice cracking as he pointed. A small shape was bundled in front of Silas on the saddle. A guttural roar of fury and despair escaped Willie's lips. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and ran for the barn, Mira right behind him. "Stay here. Lock the door," he yelled over his shoulder. "No," she said, her face set with a terrifying resolve. "Eliza was my friend, even if I didn't remember. This is my fight too." They rode into the teeth of the blizzard, the world reduced to a vortex of wind and snow. They followed Silas's tracks up the treacherous path, the same path Willie had taken a year ago, believing he was meeting Eliza. The irony was a bitter poison. He was being lured to the same spot, this time with his daughter's life as the bait. The dilapidated cabin stood against the storm, a hunched and broken thing. Light flickered from its single window. Willie dismounted, his movements swift and silent, and crept toward the door. Mira followed, her own rifle held steady. Inside, a single lantern cast long dancing shadows. Silas stood with his back to a small sputtering fire, a pistol in his hand. Rose was huddled in a corner, crying softly. "I knew you'd come." Willie Silas said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I wanted you to see this place again, to remember what you lost, what you're about to lose again." "Let her go, Silas," Willie said, stepping into the doorway, his Winchester leveled at Silas's chest. Silas laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "Let her go, so she can be raised by a thief and his vagrant whore? I don't think so. I'm her guardian now. Eliza would have wanted it this way." "You don't get to say her name," Willie snarled. "Oh, but I do." Silas purred, his mask of civility finally dropping away to reveal the raw, festering obsession beneath. "I loved her. I loved her long before you came along with your dirt-stained hands and your pathetic little homestead. She should have been mine. This land, this valley, her. It all should have been mine." His voice rose to a fever pitch. "I set the trap for you, you know. That day, I sent a note, told you Eliza was in trouble up here. I was going to bury you under that ridge. A tragic accident. But she showed up instead. Your clever, meddling wife showing up to meet her little courier." He gestured wildly with the pistol. "She found out about the deeds. A small matter. But she wouldn't listen to reason. She chose you. She chose this pathetic life over everything I could have given her." Just then, Mira stepped into the cabin from a rear entrance, having circled around. The sight of her, the smell of the pine smoke, the terror in Rose's eyes, it was the final key. Her memory came flooding back, not as a flash, but as a tidal wave of perfect, horrifying clarity. It wasn't just the deeds, Mira said, her voice ringing with newfound certainty. Silas spun around, shocked to see her. Eliza had more. She found your father's will. The real one. The one you buried after you pushed him from the widow's peak and called it a hunting accident. She had proof you murdered your own father to inherit this empire you're so proud of. The confession, and the final ugliest secret, hung in the air. Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. All pretense of control vanished. He was a cornered animal. He lunged for Rose, grabbing her and holding her in front of him as a shield. "You'll never prove it. The evidence is gone, buried with her." The old cabin groaned under the assault of the blizzard, the timbers shaking. A blast of wind ripped one of the shutters from its hinges, and snow swirled into the room, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into near darkness, lit only by the faint, dying light of the fire. In the chaos, Willie charged. He slammed into Silas, the impact sending them both crashing against the far wall. The pistol flew from Silas's hand, skittering across the floorboards. The two men grappled in the shadows, a desperate, brutal fight, fueled by a year of grief and a lifetime of hate. Outside, the wind shrieked, and a deep, ominous crack echoed from the mountain above them. The storm, like their rage, had reached its breaking point. Willie had a choice: to choke the life from the man who had destroyed his family, or to drag him into the light and force him to face a justice he had long outrun. Rose's terrified sobs cut through the noise, and the choice became clear: justice, not revenge. Willie drove his fist into Silas's jaw, a sharp cracking sound that echoed the splintering of the cabin's ancient beams. Silas slumped to the floor, dazed and defeated. At that exact moment, the cabin door burst open, revealing the snow-caked figures of Jed Willie's old ranch hand and a tall, stern-faced man in a heavy coat bearing the insignia of a U.S. Marshal. "We came as soon as we got your message." Willie Jed said, his relief palpable. Willie had sent Kobe on a desperate 2-day ride to the next county, a week before a last-ditch plea for help, to the one lawman he knew Silas couldn't buy. The marshal took in the scene with a practiced eye: the terrified child, the disheveled woman, the two men breathing heavily beside the fire. His gaze settled on Silas, who was struggling to sit up, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "Silas Kane," the marshal said, his voice booming over the wind, "you're under arrest for the murder of Eliza Wren." As Silas was hauled to his feet and bound, his empire of lies and intimidation began to crumble around him. The fight went out of him, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had lost everything because he believed he was entitled to it all. Willie rushed to Rose, scooping her into his arms. She buried her face in his neck, her small body trembling uncontrollably. He held her tight, murmuring words of comfort, his own relief so profound it was a physical ache. He was a father again, whole and complete. After the marshal had led Silas away, a strange, heavy silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the sighing of the wind as the blizzard began to wane. The storm had passed. Willie looked at Mira, who stood by the empty window frame, staring out at the now calm mountain. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, but her eyes were clear, the fog of amnesia finally and completely gone. He gently set Rose down, who immediately ran to Mira and wrapped her arms around her legs. Willie walked over to stand beside her. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, with the ghosts of the past and the fragile promise of a future. "Eliza was brave," Mira said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "She knew the risk. She was trying to protect you, all of you in this valley." "You were brave too," Willie said, his voice thick. "You both were." They stood there for a long time, watching the first rays of dawn break over the snow-covered peaks. They found a shared closure in that quiet moment, acknowledging the courage of the woman they had both cared for. It was a place of tragedy, this broken-down cabin, but it was also a place of truth. The trauma they had shared, the fight they had won, had forged a bond between them stronger than steel, a silent understanding that needed no words. They had survived the mountain, and in doing so had found a way to start healing. 1 year later, the Colorado high country was at peace. Autumn had laid its golden blanket over the valleys, and the air was crisp with the promise of a gentle winter. Silas Kane was in a federal prison, his confession in the cabin, having unraveled his entire web of corruption. The falsified deeds were voided, and the stolen water rights were returned to the small ranchers he had once terrorized. The Wren Ranch was thriving. The pastures were green, the cattle were fat, and the sound of laughter was once again a common occurrence. Perched on a southern ridge overlooking the valley stood a new building. It was small and sturdily built from local pine, with large windows that let in the morning light. It was a schoolhouse. Mira Wren, had insisted on it. Using a portion of the restitution funds recovered from Silas's estate, she had built a place of learning for the scattered children of the high country. She had honored Eliza's memory not with a cold stone monument, but with the warm, vibrant promise of education and hope. The final scene of their story unfolded on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Willie, Mira, and a 5-year-old Rose sat together on the front porch swing he had just finished building. The air smelled of pine and curing hay. Willie reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped object. "This is for you," he said softly, handing it to Mira. She unwrapped it to find a locket not of silver and secrets, but of simple hand-carved aspen wood. He had smoothed it until it felt like a river stone in her palm. The front was etched with a familiar design, a single columbine flower. "The other one belonged to the past," he said. "This one is for us." With a gentle click, she opened it. Inside, there was no room for hidden notes or painful memories. Instead, on one side was a tiny, intricately drawn image of a man, a woman, and a little girl standing before a mountain. A family. On the other side, Willie had simply carved the word home. Tears welled in Mira's eyes as she closed her fingers around the locket. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose, they walked hand in hand up the small hill behind the cabin to a quiet spot beneath a tall pine. A simple wooden marker stood there engraved with one word, Eliza. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Rose placed a single bright yellow wildflower she had picked onto the mound of earth. It was a gesture of remembrance, of gratitude, and of the profound, unshakable peace that had finally been won. They stood together for a moment, a new family forged in the crucible of a storm, and their future built not on a haunted past, but on love, resilience, and the quiet, courageous power of choice.